What is happening, y'all? It's Super Like It 2 here, and I finally get to talk about the Sonic 3 movie, and I'm just gonna get this out of the way right now. It is absolutely phenomenal. It was so worth the wait, and it is by far the best in the trilogy. I already love the first two movies, but this movie in particular really captures the potential that these previous movies had, and then some. From the characters to the soundtrack to all of the visual designs and special effects, everything comes together in such a fantastic way. And I'm basically here to gush about it for the most part. In the background, you'll probably see my gameplay of Shadow Generations, most likely. I'll have to see later on, but I have a list of talking points here, like right next to me, about certain scenes in the movie that I found pretty enjoyable or notable, things I found very positive about the movie. I have very little, if like no negatives at all, so I probably won't be talking about those as much. So yeah, without further ado, let's just get right on into it. So first thing I'm going to talk about is the boys, Team Sonic. And I'm going to save Sonic for last on this because I think his character arc throughout the movie is probably the most interesting. Like, well, aside from, say, Shadows. But he'll get his own dedicated segment. So let's talk about Tails and Knuckles first. So starting with Tails, honestly, I think he got a lot more spotlight in this movie compared to his debut in Sonic 2. He's always been sort of like the gadget guy, the brains of the group, coming up with all these different plans and whatnot, and we kind of got a little bit of that in Sonic 2, but I feel like it was really put on the forefront in this movie. Like, him coming up with the whole plan for the key heist, and just basically taking, I want to say more of like the leadership role, to be honest, only because he was the one who basically deployed like Sonic, Knuckles, Tim and Maddie into like their different areas, and this is the type of Tails that we'd see in like the adventure games, which, I mean, this movie in particular is just a giant Sonic Adventure 2 reference, so it makes sense. But just seeing that happen once again is just so nice to see. Like, they've done my voice so dirty in like a lot of the more like recent Sonic games, at least in the past like decade, and it finally like came to like a stop in Sonic Frontiers, but there's definitely still some work they could improve upon, and this is kind of like the Tails that I knew of. Just someone who was ready and willing to help, always trying to come up with a plan. And yeah, I think he was just he was great in this movie. Like, I really have no complaints whatsoever. And of course, shout outs to Colleen as well for voicing Tails once again. She did an excellent job as usual. Now next up, I want to talk about Knuckles, and of course Knuckles was amazing. A lot of his lines were so enjoyable. Like, I got a couple laughs out of them. Idris Elba killed it as always. Like, really isn't much to go over there. Like once again, he was also just a great part of the movie, and especially in terms of being like the level-headed like keeper of peace essentially in the group. Like, Knuckles is usually like portrayed as like somewhat of a hothead, and he still kinda is in this movie. Well, and even then, I can't even necessarily call him a hothead. More so, it's just he's very anxious to, you know, get up into the action is all. And so, him sort of being the mediator of the group, I mean, alongside Tails, but it's more so him sort of keeping the reins in, was also nice to see. And that's also why I want to talk about Sonic in particular. So, Sonic throughout this movie, he goes through a pretty interesting arc. Like, this is an arc that he's never gone through in either the first two movies or even in any Sonic media other than maybe the comics. And that was him sort of trying to get a grasp of working in a team with Knuckles and Tails. And when all of that doesn't come through, even though he constantly is like, this is the right thing to do, and I don't want to make the wrong choices, he sort of throws that to the side the moment when Tom goes into a coma because of Shadow, and then he basically just throws any sort of values out of the window, and he is full on like, I want to get this done now, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to do so, which results in him clashing with Knuckles as he tries to go for the Master Emerald. And of course, Knuckles is trying to talk him down into not giving into his anger and his vengeance until Knuckles decided, okay, I'm gonna let you do this, but just know about the consequences that will follow after. And so basically Sonic goes on the same sort of arc that Shadow has been going on throughout the movie, making a parallel between the two of them, and how not only do they just look similar, but they could essentially have their roles like either swapped or just be aligned. And I think that was just a really cool direction that they took for Sonic, because the directors have stated that they want this version of Sonic to be a character with growth, which is something that Game Sonic is not known for whatsoever. He is a static character, and his whole deal is that even though he's essentially the same throughout all the games, a lot of the characters that he meets and interacts with grows because of him. So to see that sort of in reverse is honestly pretty interesting, and it's definitely portrayed Sonic in ways that I wouldn't have seen other than in, like, say, the Archie comics, and especially when he goes into Super Sonic. Like, honestly, there were some very subtle hints of Fleetway Sonic in that, and it kind of just goes to show how dangerous Sonic could be if he lets that anger consume him. But before I move on to the next character, I also want to give a shout out to Ben Schwartz's performance as Sonic, because this is by and large his best performance of him, like, in all the films. Like, the range of emotions that he has portrayed throughout, like, Sonic's more happy, more cheery sort of side, all the jokes and quips that he makes, it just flows so naturally to that turning point where he just wants to get things done. He is so filled with, like, just sadness and anger and just absolute confusion. It just really came together, and I think he did a wonderful job playing as him. I wasn't sure about him in Sonic 1 when he was cast as the role for Sonic, but then Sonic 2 definitely solidified him as a great voice for Sonic. But this movie really propelled him, in my opinion. So, big shout outs to him, and I hope he continues to voice Sonic in the future movies. So now we get into probably the main attraction for a lot of people, and that would be Shadow the Hedgehog. And man, there is so much I could say about Shadow, but I think they pretty much nailed his character to a T. Like, admittedly, he doesn't have too many lines in the movie. Though that's kind of how Shadow is. He pretty much is get business done and then just talk later. And they pretty much put that on full display, from the breakout scene to the chaseway in Tokyo when him and Sonic are racing down the highway. And Keanu Reeves did such a fantastic job voicing him as well. Again, in a similar way to Ben Schwartz, his range of emotions for the various scenes is so well done. Like, when Shadow feels rage or sadness, you can really feel that in Keanu Reeves' performance. He did an excellent job voicing him, and hopefully he can return in future projects, which does seem to be likely. Now we get to the other two characters, which were both played by one person, the one and only Jim Carrey. And I'm just going to say this right now, I think Jim Carrey absolutely stole the show in this movie. Like, this was his best performance as Eggman in all of the films prior. And on top of that, he also played the role as Gerald. And him being able to play off of himself so well that, like, you can very well be convinced that it's two different people acting as different characters. Like, he just did a phenomenal job, honestly. A lot of the scenes that he was in were so fun and just hilarious to watch. Of course, there was the one dance segment when they were invading the gun base, where him and Gerald were basically just having this dance off. Like, it was like, when I first saw that in the theater, like, I just couldn't believe it. Like, it's such a Jim Carrey thing to do, but it still, like, caught me off guard completely, and I just absolutely enjoyed every minute of it. Anytime he was on the screen was just an absolute joy. And with the way things were set up in this movie, I can't help but think that this might be his last portrayal as Eggman. And if this is his last film that he's gonna be starring in, at least for this series of movies, then I think he went out with an absolute bang. Like, I can't give enough props to him for what he's done in this movie. So, to the characters of Eggman and Gerald, Eggman goes on a pretty interesting arc where he's basically at rock bottom. He doesn't really take care of himself that much. He is watching Spanish soap operas, which is very funny. And only one who really cares about him is Agent Stone, who's constantly, like, looking after him. But that sort of changes once he finally meets with Gerald, which Gerald is an absolute psycho. And this portrayal of Gerald in this movie is basically a what-if scenario for Sonic Adventure 2, I think. Because in Sonic Adventure 2, Gerald not only was captured by Gun, but was also executed via a firing squad. But this version of Gerald was captured and detained for 50 years, but was let free because he gave Gun the schematics to the Eclipse cannon. So this basically acts as a what-if for Gerald, in the sense that he's still alive, and what things would he do if he wasn't executed in that chamber. And of course, in Sonic Adventure 2, with that final message of his, he was completely unhinged. He wanted the world to die simply because his granddaughter was taken from him. And this movie version of Gerald is pretty much the exact same way, but he gets to act out on those desires for himself instead of just saying that final message for when someone activates the Eclipse Cannon. No, he's just gonna activate it himself. And of course he gets the help of Shadow to accomplish this, which also is another interesting point to talk about, is that Shadow was basically in Sonic Adventure 2 going off on his own will to basically unlock the Eclipse Cannon and get revenge on the world, essentially, for what happened to Maria. Now, in Sonic Adventure 2, Gerald planted memories in Shadow's mind that Maria wanted the world to be destroyed, but in actuality, she wanted to protect the world because she wanted to be a part of it someday because of her illness. And so instead of those memories being completely implanted in Shadow of like Maria saying that she wants the world to be gone, it's instead personified as Gerald in the flesh actively telling Shadow, remember what they took from us, we have to do this. And this always happens when Shadow has any form of self-doubt or is just unsure of what he's doing is right. So I think that's a very interesting sort of perspective in terms of how they portrayed Gerald in this movie, and I really wish we got to see in the games, but of course that would have to be in some sort of like alternate timeline or whatever, and I don't even think that's gonna happen given what we've seen in Shadow Generations. So seeing this in the movie was pretty dope, to say the least. So back to Eggman, he finally found someone that he could call family, and he is just so infatuated with the idea of Gerald being his grandfather and finally getting to experience the love that he never got. And this really plays off the idea that's been like kind of planted throughout a lot of the games, is that what if Eggman got the love and attention that he required, then he wouldn't have been a bad guy, essentially. So basically the whole movie, Eggman is just trying to help his grandfather in any way possible to achieve his goals, just so he can be accepted and loved. Meanwhile, Gerald doesn't really think much of Eggman whatsoever because he considers Maria the only family that truly mattered to him, and anyone else was just an afterthought. So I think this is also a pretty cool interpretation of Eggman that we get to see in the games here and there, but not really to this degree. So it's just very dope to see nonetheless. Now it's about time I actually talked about scenes in the movie. So the first scene that I really want to delve into is the backstory of Shadow and Maria and their relationship. Like, this interpretation of the two's bond is one of the best I've honestly ever seen in any form of media. Now, with Shadow Generations and Shadow Generations Dark Beginnings animated series, we get to see a lot more of how exactly Shadow and Maria bonded and what exactly they meant to each other. And in this movie, for one, we are not on Space Colony Arc, we are still on Earth, and there doesn't seem to be any hints or signs that Maria has an illness, although her being at that gun base to begin with probably implies that she did have an illness, but she basically moves there, and an interesting detail is that she had roller skates on the first day that she basically got to the base, and this was something that was kind of pointed out to me. I didn't really think about this myself. Some of my best friends actually pointed this out to me, and it was the fact that the reason why Shadow himself skates while he's running is because of Maria and how she loved to skate, which of course is not the canon reason as to why Game Shadow would do this, but it's just a nice little like tie-in, and it just makes so much sense when you look at the two's relationship with one another. So on that day, Maria ends up meeting Shadow, and essentially she becomes the friend that Shadow never received. All of the gun agents and researchers see him as a monster, a sort of test experiment, basically a key to unlocking a new age for energy and nothing more. But Maria saw a friend in him, and they basically just became siblings, essentially. Like, they would get into a whole heap of trouble across the base, and I think what's interesting about this interpretation of Maria is that she's like a bit of a troublemaker. Well, not even a bit. She's like a real big troublemaker. And a lot of the like previous interpretations of Maria just essentially painted her as sort of like an angel, like she could do no wrong. And I guess we got like more hints of that mischievous sort of side to her in like Dark Beginnings, but they really played it up here, and I think it just makes her as a character even more interesting. So I'm glad they kind of leaned into that aspect of her. And so they get into all these fun sort of escapades, skating around the base, watching movies together, and then it all comes to a scene where Maria and Shadow sneak out of the base just to go and see the stars in basically the same flower field that was shown in Dark Beginnings, which I think is a really cool tie-in if that was a reference to that. And Shadow basically confides in Maria, talking about how all of the gun staff see him as nothing more than a monster, and how he just doesn't feel like he belongs, with Maria reassuring him that he is her friend, and that no matter what happens, or no matter what people think of him, he has the power to make a choice for himself to become who he wants to be, not because of his abilities, but because of his heart. And then Shadow basically tells Maria that he wouldn't exactly know what to do without her, and that just kind of sets up the tragedy that happened at the base and how emotional that scene is, because this was basically Shadow's like light in the darkness, which I forgot about this part. I didn't mean to gloss over this, but in that scene where they were in the flower field looking up at the stars, Maria talks about how stars shine their light towards the earth, but that light that shined is basically a remnant of a star that has basically died off, and that even if the star is gone, the light still shines. And this will be something I'll point out a little bit later. So once we get to actually see the tragedy in which Gunn tried to take Shadow away from both Gerald and Maria, and ended up blowing up what seemed to be chaos energy reserves inside of the base, which led to Maria's death, the scene where Shadow is just looking down at Maria, then looking up at Gerald, and just realizing that she's gone, the anger and pain that you could see on not only his face, but also through Keanu Reeves' voice acting, it just felt so real, man. Like, it hurt just to watch. Like, I almost teared up during that scene, honestly, and that led to Shadow using all of that rage and anger to power up the Eclipse cannon, and like, man, like it's just a really, honestly, quite a sorrowful scene just to see Shadow vent all that anger into what will essentially become the world's destruction. And it's scenes like that that just really sold me on this movie, even more so than it already did. Like, I am so happy about how they handled a lot of the heavier tones in the movie, and handled a lot of the like darker themes, which I guess will now lead into my next sort of talking point, which is the clash between Sonic and Shadow, which essentially happens after the point in which Shadow knocks Tom into a coma. Sonic, not knowing what else to do, wants to just end things by force by taking the Master Emerald, going super, and just dealing with Shadow himself, which then sort of leads into them going back and forth about how Shadow is telling Sonic, now you understand the pain I've been through for over 50 years, but Sonic's constantly refusing to think that they were both the same when he was acting out in the exact same way that Shadow was throughout the movie. And that leads into probably one of the best choreographed fight scenes I've seen in a movie in a long time, with them going back and forth as Super Sonic and Super Shadow. It was so fantastic, bro. In the theater, I was literally jumping out of my seat the entire time that fight scene took place, and I just couldn't even get a hold of myself, because it's it was just unreal to watch. Yeah, this is Super Sonic and Super Shadow duking it out on the big screen. It was just amazing. So then we get to a point where Shadow mocks Sonic, and that basically tips Sonic over the boiling point, to where he basically hits him with a Shoryuken of the gods and sent him all the way to the moon. And just when Sonic was about to finish the job, he then realizes what Tom said to him earlier on in the film, and then he comes to his senses and realizes that what he was doing was not who he was. And then that's when we get a heart-to-heart between Sonic and Shadow about the people that they've lost and how they've basically didn't know how to cope with it or how to move forward. But Sonic tells Shadow that the love that you felt is stronger than the loss and pain that you feel because of it. And so that's when Shadow realizes what he's been doing and all the mistakes that he's made, and now he wants to fix them, just because he knows that that's what Maria would have wanted. And so with that in mind, we get probably one of the coolest scenes I have ever seen in any movie, to be honest, and that is Sonic and Shadow dapping each other up into becoming their super forms, all the while having Live and Learn play in the background. That made me go wild, bro. In the theater, I was screaming my lungs out. I was jumping up and down the whole time, which thankfully the movie theater that me and the boys were in was completely empty, so we could just go completely insane in there without getting judged. So that made me pop off so hard, seeing that all of us honestly were just in absolute hype when we saw that scene. And then the following super fight afterwards, bro, it was just what can I say? It's just peak. It just absolutely is peak. There really isn't any more I can say about it. It's just, I could watch that scene over and over again and not get tired of it. It was that good. And then of course we have Eggman realizing that his grandfather never really cared about him. The line where Gerald said, "You were no Maria," that was a gut punch, bro. I was not expecting that. So Eggman turned on him. He now wants to do the right thing. Instead of obliterating the world, he wants to save it. And that basically ensues a whole fight scene between those two, which was so fun, by the way. Once again, shoutouts to Jim Carrey. But yeah, basically Eggman gets saved by Knuckles and Tails. They finally steer the Eclipse Cannon away from Earth, but with the help of Sonic and Shadow, blocking the beam. And, I mean, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, they do end up beaming the moon, and this results in Shadow basically telling Eggman that the Eclipse Cannon, or rather the whole like space colony arc, that's essentially what it is just gonna explode due to all the chaos energy that was overstimulated inside of it. And so Shadow is gonna push the space colony arc away from Earth and needs Eggman to help him stabilize all that energy so that he can have the time to do so. And this is where I go back to the part where I said this seems like a final bow for like Jim Carrey as Eggman, because he basically went out as a hero at the end of the day, and I'm not sure if he will come back to reprise his role as Eggman in like future films, but if anything, with how this movie played out, this seems like this was it. And so he did such a good job playing as Eggman. And this scene also kind of turned me up just a little bit. Maybe it's because of the music and whatnot, but like it was just like, man, like you would never see Eggman do this in the games, to be honest. Like there are times where he's come through in the end to like save the world and whatnot, but like to this degree, it probably won't happen anytime soon. And so that's when we have him and Shadow basically sacrifice themselves to save the Earth. And, well, yeah, Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, they reunite. Sonic asks them for forgiveness, and they just hug it out, and they go back home. Tom's okay. They're all pretty much, like, safe and all that. And they finish it off with the race that they were planning on doing at the beginning of the film. And, yeah, that basically concluded Sonic 3. As a Sonic fan, this was such a spectacular watch, both on the first time and the second time. I absolutely love this film, as you can probably tell with how long this video's gotten, but there's just so much I want to talk about. There's even stuff that I haven't gone into detail about that I'd love to, but I would just be here all day if that were the case. Like, this movie is nothing short of incredible, and I'm just like wondering like how they can top this in the next one, which, by the way, goes into the after credits scenes with freaking Metal Sonic. Now, I had a feeling that he would be the main sort of character or draw to the fourth movie. If not him, it'd probably be Silver, but it just made sense to go to Metal Sonic before that. And his design is simply just perfect. Like, he's basically one-to-one with his in-game design, and seeing him on the big screen is also just absolutely amazing, but not as amazing as the next character reveal, which was Amy Rose. Now, I didn't think I'd ever get so hyped for an Amy reveal as much as I did when I first saw this movie. Like, they, again, nailed it with her design. Like, to me, she's, like, perfect. Like, there were many fan interpretations or designs of what she looked like in the movies, and a lot of them just kind of didn't sit right with me. But this finalized design, well, it probably isn't even finalized, but this design that they've come up with is just absolutely spot on, and I'm very excited to see what they come up with for Sonic 4. Which, by the way, they did confirm to be dropping in like 2027, so see you guys in about 3 years time. But yeah, once again, Sonic 3 is such a fantastic movie, and I pretty much loved everything about it from start to finish. That's where I'm just gonna leave my thoughts off on. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this sort of movie review. This is very long, considering this is my first movie review ever. I'll probably try to shorten any of these in the future if I can, but I just had so much to talk about and I just needed to get my thoughts out there. So yeah, I hope any of y'all who watched till the end have enjoyed those. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel, because if you couldn't tell, I love Sonic, so any sort of Sonic stuff that might pop up in the future, I'm bound to talk about. Also, let me know your guys' thoughts on this movie as a whole. Like, what scenes were your favorite to watch? What did you enjoy about the movie? Maybe some stuff that you wish you could have seen more of, or maybe some things you didn't like. I just want to get like a whole discussion about this movie going and just, talk about how amazing it is. And yeah, I will see you all next time. Take care, y'all.